I don't follow all the philosophical allusions.
And I would be happy to try to explicate if
no,
it's
it's okay. Perhaps this is not the time for me to catch up on my lack of education in philosophy. But yeah, I mean, I think I do get the gist of what you're advocating. Forms of research which are not subject to the market, to the drive to quantify graduate throughput and
right.
meet the needs of funders, right. and what you call, various forms of control that we have today. And I like what you say, but right at the beginning, you began with Marx's example of the schoolmaster who is sort of not subsumed
yes.
under capital. Now that I take to be the schoolmaster who doesn't work for, you said, an education-mongering institution.
Correct.
Which is, of course, what happened over time and what we all do today. And that's the, yeah.
Right.
But my little understanding of schoolmasters, of, pre-modern schoolmasters and also pre-modern universities, say medieval universities, where scholars actually were paid by the students, if I understand it correctly.
Correct.
So those schoolmasters were really dependent upon whichever pupils they could muster and their parents. Now that was a very insecure, I guess I'm being awfully kind of practical and simplistic here, but that was a very insecure mode of life. So we've traded that in for a more secure mode of life, but with a loss of control.
I agree. I mean, I think
you are advocating remaining, not going back to a situation where we paid by our own students, but you would like us to recover some of the freedom.
Although in effect we are paid by our students. I mean, that's what tuition is.
Yes, but we're no longer autonomous because it's all, in great big centralized institutions. So I suppose I'm wondering, is there not a practical impediment to what you're proposing?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I am doing toward the end, not so much toward the beginning, but toward the end, is that I'm trying to turn something upside down. In other words, I think we worry often about how do we understand, teach, whatever, the humanities within the university, a knowledge-mongering institution. And the inversion I'm sort of playing with there is the idea of, well, let's try to figure out what kind of activity we want to affirm, and then worry about where, how to think about what kind of structure it ought to fit into. And in fact, let the structure, in a sense, be led by some kind of struggle to make clear what we're trying to affirm about the work of study. So the schoolmaster, I mean, what you're doing there is you're catching the sort of history of a particular, like the schoolhouse, or even the tutor who would come from home to home, and this sort of thing. And, those are different ways of thinking about the location in which certain economic relationships are possible, and educational ones as well. And I think we want to be careful about constantly starting with a set of assumptions about, well, in what place will we do something that we figure out how to fit there somehow, and try to find a way to push ahead on this idea of, well, what is this activity that we think ought to find a host somewhere, and then go from there. It seems to me we don't spend enough time trying to sort that out.
I'm only working to move this around, sir.
I'm interested in trying to think about this modeling of work and play in relation to something that's been quite shockingly successful in this arena, and that's the Apple empire. Mm-hmm. If you go into an Apple store, everybody is wearing a T-shirt that says work is play. Mm-hmm. What does one do in trying to apprehend or even philosophically grasp how capital has produced a modeling of production that now has everyone gulled into thinking that they're in a condition of bliss when they are working 28 hours a day for Mr. Jobs. How does one get outside of that kind of inversion of this paradigm and retain something like the uselessness of play rather than the application of play to someone else's capital extraction?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's essential is trying to, first of all, be clear about how work and play have been brought into interaction with one another. And I mean, the example that you give is excellent. I mean, it's very clear that in a certain way, what informatics and sort of computer technology and you know, the entire sort of virtualization of knowledge has facilitated is a bringing together of you know, the activities we might at one point have associated with working, and those which perhaps not playing but gaming, you know, so that we now see many things that had sort of separate spheres in which they flourished as converging in ways. And I think that's part of what Marx is trying to describe when he talks about the real subsumption of labor. All these sort of incommensurable differences among things start actually to acquire a kind of an uncanny and frightening homogeneity. So the first step is trying to be clear about, well, what does it mean to do that play and work maneuver? But what I'm proposing here is that one of the things that is needed is trying to be a little more astute about how we understand work, especially as it's being treated in such a way that it can now be fused with playing. And I use the Donzelot example because one of the things that he's trying to draw out is that was very conspicuously being used as the way to advertise, you know, how it is that you would want to stay in your position because you enjoyed it. It made you happy, and they gave you benefits, and they took care of your health, and they made sure that, you know, you had some paltry pharmacological treatment for your depression, but that they were caring about your enjoyment of your work. And that seems to me to be a point at which, as I'm suggesting here, we see work being pressured in an interesting way, but it needs to be extended. We need to go further down that path. And so I'm sort of proposing that, yes, step one, let's be clear about how certain things are being confused now, and what are the forces driving those. Step two, well, now that we understand something about the risks of the confusion, what will happen when we resort? And I do feel that Donzelot is at times a bit puritanical. It's as though he doesn't like enjoyment, right? And that seems to me to be rather silly. On the other hand, I understand what it is that he's worried about. But there's the baby in the bathwater. Right?
You didn't give the same medicine to Nietzsche and to Heidegger. Nietzsche, at a time of a crisis of the West, of modernity, of the university system crisis, arrives at these ideas of affirmation, of dissent, of race, of issues like that are all part of a certain thinking in Europe that constituted a humanities that lost out in terms of the German university as it evolved. Right. Heidegger, the next crisis point, you know, the metaphysic of sorrow about the West. And he says in the introduction to metaphysics that it is the West he is worried about and the degeneration. And his ideas emerge and become very powerful for a while, cause, in a sense, the Benjamin phenomenon at some stage. So what I'm trying to say is that why should some people be contextualized and others decontextualized in order to borrow concepts from them? And won't Nietzsche bring with him precisely a kind of vision of a will to power that perhaps must be kept outside our thinking of the humanities and the university system?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that part of the reason that I put the emphasis on 1968 in France is because it was in that context that two I think, quite interesting and, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. No, the reason I put the emphasis on France in 1968 is because it was in that context that a quite interesting rereading of both Heidegger and Nietzsche was underway. And so part of what that was trying to do is to not necessarily ignore the context of the history of Germany and state formation in Germany, but to try not to sort of draw the sort of conclusions that have been drawn over and over and over about situating them in such a way that those ideas could not travel, that they were just simply locked into the moment at which they arose. So I mean, partly it's because of that focalizing of things. Now, I do think that if you sit down and sort of think about, okay, so how do we understand what Heidegger is up to, what is Nietzsche up to, what does this have to do with the German university? And it's important to remember that Nietzsche did not work at the German university. He worked in a Swiss university and wrote endlessly about the future of our educational institutions. So that there would be much to sort of draw out there, to be sure. But it seems to me that it would still be important to think about how, especially in the case of Nietzsche, where you get someone who is saying a lot of very conservative things about what's going on with the university, is also saying a lot of things which grate very aggressively against those conservative formulations. And it's trying to think how it is that both of these are possible in him that become of interest. Now, I'm also here, toward the end of the piece, trying to kind of narrow down the discussion so that I'm not reconstructing for you each time, out of which places these emerged. I mean, the interesting thing about the Benjamin material, as I suspect you know, is that, that's the book that he presented as his Abil, and it was refused. It's what sealed him outside the university in an important way. So part of what I'm just trying to mark here each time, and I grant you not with the same sort of care, is the interesting way in which a set of theoretical questions for us have come out of these encounters with the university of different sorts and in different places. Now, if you're suggesting that the concept of affirmation ultimately has to be tucked into what he means by the will to power, I guess then the question is, well, what does he really mean by the will to power? I mean, can we just simply say, well, that's exactly what the Nationalist Socialist Party was up to, was the will to power? There's a much longer conversation that we'd have to sort that. But I think that there's an important way in which it's affirmation and will need to be understood as in relation, but not essentially the same thing. Yes?
I think I have, first just an offhand comment. The moment the university located itself as a site of the production of knowledge, well, okay, bang it went. Who could ever take an ever faster conveyor belt kicking out knowledge very seriously? Nobody can take the sort of knowledge that comes off the production line ever faster extremely seriously. So if we look at that way, I think there's a dead-end street. But I was also asking concerning Nietzsche. The idea of affirmation is fine, especially in view of the use that, say, for instance, Adorno makes of the labor of the negative, which I sometimes find just terribly idealistic and terribly Hegelian. So yes, but Nietzsche himself, I believe, struggled throughout his life to find what he wanted to affirm. You read a book of his, and he started off by saying, this is not going to be a polemical book. This is going to be entirely affirmative. 2 pages, then he starts fulminating against something, and from then on it never stops. I do not myself believe that when he affirms it's always the will to power, and he does deal with that in different ways. But other things that he affirms, hardness, discipline, Zucht, also concerning the university. I think to talk about affirmation, in the light of what has happened since 68. It's extremely important because since then affirmation has not been in view much. But I think we're going to have as hard a task as Nietzsche had finding what we wish to affirm.
No, I have to agree, obviously, but I also think one of the interesting things that happens in Nietzsche is that you have these books like The Genealogy of Morals, which presents itself as a book not interested in polemics, but very quickly becomes one. It reminds you that what he said in Also Sprach is basically, I do not mean saying yes. It has nothing to do with saying yes. It has everything to do with trying to get around this particular way of thinking about the subject, the human subject that he found coming out of that tradition of Hegel, where you have to start by splitting the mind and reality and then figure out the logic by which it's going to historically resolve itself. For him, this is where affirmation has to take root, in refusing that way of getting at what human consciousness might be about. Now, in relation to that, you can say all kinds of things about particulars, people, books, institutions, etc. So, I mean, among other things, what it does is it reminds you may not know what saying yes means.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. I don't want to go into the Hegel because you can imagine I'm not included in Hegel's board. You know that one. But then I want to go to Heidegger, and the point you brought out in Heidegger is Heidegger rector address. Heidegger is a rector address it's the Nazi rector, yeah? And we have to emulate him because he said we should work and study at the same time, yeah? I subscribe to hermeneutics, and I want your assistance here. Can I take hermeneutics out of Heidegger? Can I say, okay, I just take his tools and I use him, but you said it's ignorance of his politics. But if Hegel is ignorant of his politics, he's a great philosopher, how can he be ignorant? You understand? So
yeah.
Then can I pick and choose, or can I throw away Hegel with the bathwater? That's what I want to have, because I know what Hegel stands for, and I don't expect someone in a Jewish university to be trying to work with Heidegger rather. So that is something I wanted to unpack from
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I would say that there are lots of Jewish intellectuals who work with Heidegger. I can see exactly what you're pointing to as what might be the source of their ambivalence about that. I also sense that, part of what's at stake there has to do with, to put it very crudely, understanding your enemy. Getting inside of a particular project in order to know why it is that it hates you. There is also Heidegger is obviously processing a lot of intellectual traditions that end up having very little to do with what's going on in Nazi Germany. I think the other point you're making here is a very important one about picking things out of people. Right? It seems to me, and I hope I've given you some kind of illustration of this, it seems to me that there's nothing terribly misguided about picking, but it's when you're weaving that it becomes more important. In other words, what you have picked, when you weave it together, can it say something? Can it do something? Or are you inheriting problems that you're just avoiding in order to pick? So there's a kind of issue here that has to do with method, how you work in a way that is ethical. And I think it's a way of guarding against that kind of easy eclecticism that one finds all the time, but which in a certain way is lazy. So what I'm saying is I think it's the weave that you produce out of the things that you pick that's vital. And what I'm doing in this paper is trying to pick some things that I think enter into interesting tension or help to consolidate something and to weave them together. But yes, I'm isolating, I'm pulling them out of as was said earlier, about the context of the German educational system.
Prof, thank you very much for the presentation. I think, I was thinking there are many types, many phases or types of ruin. I was thinking of colonial ruin. And I was also thinking that there's a form of ruin, a type of ruin that comes out of a desire to fashion post-colonial modernity. So, and there's some other person, what I was reading the other time, some other person was trying to mention that our lives are in ruin and that there is a sort of structural ruin that emerged out of colonialism. And I tend to take us out a little bit out of the university now. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask, is there any way the colonial ruin could have produced the crisis, the present ruin we find ourselves? Thank you.
I think that the easy answer is yes, but since I've been guarding against saying yes, I'll have to say more than that, which is to say, it strikes me that just as one might argue that one of the effects of the history of colonialism is that it has made a certain past irretrievable. If one argues that, then it would seem to me that whatever emerges as the ruin that we want to call the post-colonial state, in a certain way, it obeys the same kind of logic of no return. There's no way to go back to something before. Which means that the kind of national projects in the post-colonial era that have come to ruin for one reason or another, nevertheless, give us the material out of which whatever is possible will be made. So it strikes me that the kind of thing that Mamdani is talking about is, precisely how do we take a university system which has made its compromises with the logic of development, consultancy, quantification. How do we take that structure and, if I can invoke this Benjaminianism, and find the sort of beauty of the plan that shines forth there when you see this wasn't it, this isn't it. To me, that's the sort of situation in which one works, and I would say it's important at that point not to simply process this in the mode of negation. No, 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 no. But to say, okay, what will I say yes to now? And how do I develop that in a way that doesn't keep treating the mind in the way that Hegel was thinking about it. That tries to do something that fundamental. It's not what is your course, what is the topic of your seminar, what are you doing as a subject? That's the thing that you want to say, how do I affirm that? How do I find the place for that?
I think I have a question that wants to call attention to the ignorant schoolmaster. And I'm thinking here, this is a book that Rancia did, and I wondered whether you would think of that as a particular kind of work, because there is the work of translation. There's the work of undoing the kind of hierarchies between teacher and student, or discipline and or master and disciple. And so I wondered whether you're asking us to go back to the ignorant schoolmaster as a particular text that might animate the discussion of a rethought humanities and reworking in the way that you presented it. But this other question I have relates to this idea of the defense of the humanities, which is clearly underway in the US in a way that has that hasn't been seen in a very long time. And so the overproduction of texts now that set out to defend the humanities against what you're calling for, which is something in the order of a different orientation, to the humanities. What is the place of critique in that distinction that you're drawing between a humanities that is being defended and a humanities that is beginning to open up onto the question of a different orientation?
All right. Let's take the Rancière stuff first. It seems to me that one of the things that's going on in that book is an effort to, in a sense, reground the practice of philosophy. The reason that, one is sort of thinking about ignorance, sooner or later comes around to this problem of the utility of knowledge and whether ignorance, in a sense, acquires its use because of how it provokes the intervention of the teacher. I can take that ignorance away and convert it into knowledge. And it gives me a goal, it gives me a purpose, it gives me a sense of what my outcome might be. And I think in much of that book there's a kind of effort to, try this project of giving, to use your expression, philosophy or theory a different kind of orientation. Still, one of the things I would say is that he does tend to focus on very specific kinds of transformations thought to be especially illuminating of that larger project. So, changing the relationship between the schoolmaster and the disciple or the student. Right? This strikes me as a kind of way of thinking about what one might do without necessarily thinking about what the doing is. And that's the part of it where I'm trying to make a slightly different sort of point from what I see him doing. Nevertheless, I mean, there are all kinds of very, I think, important formulations in there that address this problem of how we want to think about the life of the mind, human consciousness. Why is it that a particular way of understanding reason has generated certain assumptions about what's valuable and what's not? All of these things, it seems to me, are extraordinarily important. With that one caveat, that I think it tends to focus on something like tasks and not so much the labor of doing them. Critique. I mean, it does seem to me that there is, this goes back to the Nietzsche discussion a little bit. There is evidence of certainly what we would want to call critique in the Genealogy of Morals or any other text of Nietzsche's you might want to look at. So it's not as though the power of affirmation has to be understood as an abrogation of the work of criticism. I wouldn't see that following at all. But it does seem to me that it does ask us to examine the problem of, so what makes criticism critical? What is its force as some kind of intervention in a present designed to transform that present in some kind of productive way? Now, much of what Nietzsche seems to be trying to do is to suggest, well, you need a whole different, as he kept sort of saying, you needed a new tablet of values in order to do this kind of thing. But that means it's a form of critique, but one that is also asking us, well, what do we mean by criticism? What is the critical moment in criticism? Now, part of what I'm doing in this piece is sort of accepting that there's something very important that comes out of the tradition of Marxism, which has to do with understanding what the critique of political economy, what was critical about that critique. Right? And it has to do, in a certain way, with putting on the table the importance of, in their minds, a kind of materialist account of the production of value. Right? And that once we've got that in place, then we can start talking about what criticism is. Their whole dissatisfaction with Feuerbach and the young Hegelians, et cetera, was all having to do with the fact that, well, you think that this critical approach to religion that calls itself secular humanism is a critique. Well, but it's a critique framed within the terms of the discussion so thoroughly, it has no critical purchase whatsoever. So that's the piece of this that I think is that still needs to be hung on to, is to not give up on critique, but include as part of one's task raising this question of what makes it critical. In relation to what is it critical?
I'm not quite clear. Can you please elaborate a little bit? Are you making an affirmation when you say that part of the evils of colonialism is that it leads to a part which becomes irretrievable? Is that an affirmation? Because I was wondering, what do we make of our tasks as post-colonial scholars if we look at the destinies of post-colonial societies in that light? Where also do we put the nationalist project if we think of colonialism as leading to irretrievable parts?
Right. No, I mean, I would describe it, and I think I did use the language of affirming essentially the situation in which one struggles. Because what I'm trying to politically criticize is the idea that a certain sort of nostalgic tone is required for sort of effective critical engagement with the present. We need to know exactly what it is that we don't want to lose, if at all possible. So I am trying there to strike this affirmative tone. And on the question of the national, right, I mean, it seems to me that there is there's been plenty of debate about to what extent the nation is a concept that is really going to be productive under the post-colonial condition that one finds oneself in. And that strikes me as certainly needing to be sorted carefully, right? Because if you look at a chapter like The Pitfalls of National Consciousness of Fanon's in The Wretched of the Earth, what is he saying? He's basically saying, look, if what nationalism has become is the empowerment of a particular class, the bourgeoisie, then we don't need any more nationalism because it produces a pitfall. It produces us as a kind of political project that is seeking, in fact, to transform essentially the color of a class society. Should we affirm that? I think he's saying no, we should not. We should not affirm that. But at the same time, it seems pretty clear that he's also saying there's some kind of an impulse or drive in the national project that the bourgeoisie has co-opted, but which remains affirmable. We have to figure out how to put it to work. And I think that's the kind of thing that I was trying to say there. I mean, that there's something there that involves being very thorough and careful in trying to get at, so what are the constraints that we're trying to overcome? And I'm not partial to this idea, which one will also find in Foucault, of these ideas of breaks, of absolute ruptures in history. Because it seems to me it's very hard to demonstrate that there is such a thing. Right? We can talk about varying kinds of transformations in the concept of representation or in the concept of wealth or the sorts of things that he looks at. But the language of break often makes it sound as though it's not from within the ruin, it's from within the void that something is produced. And that seems to me to be very misleading. I mean, so that the problem of the nation, the problem of the state in its relation to the nation, the problem of the international community, the globalization of culture, all of those things are going to be touchstones for saying, so is there, as Fanon found in the National Project, something affirmable in it that can be teased away from this particular incarnation of it in the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisies?
John, thank you very, very much. I think on behalf of everyone, that was very insightful and very...
I hope so.
And it will incite us to think again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I also just want to thank our Dean, Duncan Brown, for supporting this lecture and for allowing us to convene these annual lectures. And to the DVC, Professor Ramesh Paruthram, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and the Mellon Foundation for allowing us to have at least 1 month with you to talk through some of these questions. So there's more to come, and we promise to press you on some of these other issues. Thank you very much.
You do.
Please join us for some refreshments.